Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much, Anjana, and thank you to our guests, Mr. Saint-Amand, Mr. Gaspard, Mr. Hanif, and Mr. Estevao. Following this conversation about international tax reform, we can wonder, what is the latitude of governments to adapt tax policies for multinationals? So we've asked two scholars to tell us what their academic perspective is about the power of multinationals over tax policy. Our first expert and speaker is Mr. Ronen Palan. He is a professor of international political economy at City University of London. Ronen has published many works, which include with Anastasia Nesvetailova, Sabotage, the Business of Finance, published in 2020. The Offshore World, published in 2003, and with Richard Murphy and Christian Chavagneux, they wrote Tax Havens, How Globalization Really Works, published in 2010. Ronen is currently a European Research Council advanced grant holder. He is studying technique of organization and arbitrage employed by multinational enterprises. So without further ado, Mr. Ronen Palan.
So the question today is whether multinational enterprises are undermining state tax autonomy or not. And the answer, as usual, in my view at least, is yes and no. It just depends which states we're talking about. Multinational corporations or multinational enterprise, whatever you want to call them, have learned to undermine state tax autonomy by using rule of incorporations and taxation of states, of one states, one against each other. It's called tax jurisdictional arbitrage. These techniques work effectively by identifying gaps and loopholes or omissions in the law of one country or another, and basically taking advantage of those gaps in order to advance their interests. Some of these techniques became very well known. One of them used by Google and some other high-tech, American high-tech industry known as double Irish Dutch sandwich, which in reality is a double Dutch. These are at least two special purpose vehicles in Ireland, one in the Netherlands, but also there's a Bermudan rum on the side as well. There's typically another entity in Bermuda and so on and so forth. There are other cases that are known. For example, the way Apple has used special purpose vehicles in Ireland to found gaps in rules and law, and I'll discuss it in a moment. There are studies, excellent studies of how Luxembourg, so the LuxLeaks, we learned about different techniques of tax arbitrage used for Luxembourg. These techniques broadly known as hybrid mismatch arrangement. Now, these techniques basically use and abuse a core privilege, and the privilege of an economic association or incorporation. All economic associations must be licensed by states, and those that are operating internationally must find a way of operating or creating legal breach so they can operate and overcome this stricture because corporations are only licensed to operate in a particular territory. One of the most popular techniques that has evolved in the last century or more is to create a separate legal entity, a corporation, in a foreign country and control these corporations through equity ownership. So 100%, 50, and any ownership of about 50% and 0.1 is considered to be a subsidiary. This corporate legal entity that companies are set up or firms set up in another country, or even in the same country, they can set a few of those, they are considered in law as separate legal entities, separate legal persons or corporation. They have their own directors, although the directors they share the same directors in name of the parent company, but actually the subsidiary has their own directors. They enter into contractual relationship with the parent or with other subsidiaries of the same groups. Effectively, they are considered to be a separate entity. This is known in law as entity law. Now, that means that multinational enterprises are effectively constructions. And managers, with the help of lawyers and accountants, construct firms as a network of separate legal entities spread around the world. Many of them are now, many of the household names, consist of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, even more than 1,000 legal entities, some subsidiaries, some joint venture, affiliates, and so on and so forth. And they often, as I mentioned, can take advantage of diverging rules so that some corporate entities kind of fall between the stools, okay? In the case of Ireland, the way they fell into this between the stools is there are different rules of so-called nexus. You can set a corporate entity in a country, but then the amount of activities or people employed by the entity will determine whether the entity has what relationship that entity had with the country. In Ireland, certain entities that Apple has set up didn't meet the rules of nexus to become a tax resident. So they had entities which really attracted, because of the location in the corporate chain and the position within the Apple overall organization, most of Apple's income from non-American sales came to these particular special purpose entities in Ireland. But because of the way they were structured, they were not tax resident in Ireland. And because they were not tax resident in Ireland, but neither in the United States, they were registered in Ireland, they had no tax residency. That's just kind of the gaps that you can find out. What we find is that these particular gaps and loopholes that corporations or firms are taking advantage of tend to, generally speaking, those particularly they're used for tax, we call them in-betweeners. They tend to be often located in a third country in between parent and market. And that third country is normally offshore financial center like the Netherlands and Ireland and the like. It's placed there. And what is achieved by placing this entity in a third country is not only that you find that this particular entity is like a conduit. A lot of money goes in and out of it. And there's been a lot of research about how much money goes in and out, how much money then therefore is avoided. The key element to it is not so much the conduit element, but the fact that by introducing a third country, you introduce a third types of rules and regulation to affect that particular entity. And that can affect, like in the case of Ireland, because it's not tax resident, the whole tax returns. So in a sense, what happened is therefore, by using this technique or arbitrage, then we have multinational enterprise found a way, which is a very powerful technique, of undermining the tax autonomy, the tax of many countries that basically set up corporation in third country or fourth country and undermine the tax religion. But at the same time, paradoxically, those countries that are specializing as in-betweeners are empowered. They're empowered by the same technique, and they use them as a developmental strategy. Okay, and as a result, coming back to the question, are companies or multinational enterprises undermining the tax system or tax autonomy? Yes and no. They do. They're undermining the tax autonomy of the majority of states in the world, and particularly the powerful states, and they do it primarily through these techniques that I described, techniques of arbitrage, tax jurisdictional arbitrage. However, they also, by doing so, essentially, they always have to rely on other states to do so, because you always need to be incorporated somewhere. Every contract has to have a location, has to have a legal authority that sanctions it. And hence, paradoxically, by doing so, they're also empowering other states, normally small jurisdiction, but not so. The Netherlands is also small, or Ireland. And so my answer to the question is, as I started with, yes and no. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ronen. And to continue this conversation on multinationals and tax policy, let me now introduce Anastasia Nesvetailova, who is also a professor of international political economy at City University of London. Other than her publications with Ronen Palan, Sabotage the Business of Finance in 2020, her publications include Financial Alchemy in Crisis, The End of Liquidity Illusion. Anastasia participates in projects with the OECD and the UNCTAD, and she has been an advisor to previous UK Shadow Chancellor. So without further ado, let's go speak with Anastasia.
Okay, hello. I was asked to talk to the question of whether M&Es are undermining the state's tax autonomy. and I will be using my previous work on the Russian Federation and its extensive use of offshore as a way of answering this seemingly straightforward question. The difficulty and the interest of Russian case is that it's completely reliant on the offshore network and on offshore capital zones. Russia's richest men at the moment hold about 60% of Russia's GDP offshore. This is information for 2018. It's about $1 trillion. This is a historical development. It has been evolving through the 90s, accelerating through various reforms. And the only year that actually saw capital flying back into Russia was 2007, the peak of the oil boom. This was a peculiar year where Putin wasn't president. It wasn't necessarily connected to that, but it's just the ratio of FDI coming in and out was then positive. There was more Russian capital flowing back into the country than flying out. Russia's financial center is not in Moscow at all. It's in Cyprus, which is the main hub for Russian capital in and out. It controls from 30% and higher of FDI into Russia. At the moment, around $180 billion of Russian capital had flown into Cyprus. So whatever is happening, whenever you talk about geopolitics or any policy formation, just keep in mind that there are strong historical legacies and networks between Russian economy and specific offshore territories. There are two graphs that you will be able to see on the PowerPoint, which I will provide, that would suggest that from about 2007 to 2017, the slide captures 10 years, the leading hub of FDI back and forth has been Cyprus, with a slight revision of BVI, the Netherlands and Luxembourg becoming the leading center in 2014 following the imposition of Western sanctions. This is just to provide you the scale of the challenge and the historical context. Clearly, with such very heavy reliance on offshore finance, a question begs, to what extent is it actually a problem for the Russian Federation? The long answer is that it is a problem to an extent, but it's certainly nothing to do with tax. And the concerns that the Putin regime at the moment has about offshore finance, again, have nothing to do with tax collection or tax revenues for the budget. They have to do more about control that the president himself or the administration or the political regime has over, let's call them Russian oligarchs, although it's quite a misnomer. At the same time, you will be able to see a very peculiar map produced by the Central Bank of Russia that has since disappeared from its website, but I was lucky enough to save it. Its official classification of Russia's offshore transparency index. It has three colors, green, blue, and red. Green are mostly European offshore jurisdictions, such as the Netherlands, a lot of British former colonies and British Isles. Then it goes progressively into more dodgy territories, ending with the red group, which are high risk, such as Andorra, Liechtenstein, Liberia, Vanuatu, Nauru, and places like that. So crudely, to sum up, the reliance of Russian economy on offshore has been a problem, not necessarily from the tax collection perspective, but from the reliance on something external and so prevalent. There have been some institutional attempts to address it and to monitor the situation. The most forceful of them came in 2011, when Mr. Putin actually announced a huge de-offshorization campaign, the result of which was supposed to bring Russian capital back in under the political gaze of Moscow. Several series of reforms were launched. They were declared success in 2016-17, where officials said that capital is flying back, companies are re-registering into Russia. There is a high-profile case of Oleg Deripaska, who was forced by the sanctions to bring his capital and equity back into post-Soviet orbit. Well, as of 2016, Cyprus remains the leading supplier of capital into Russia, followed by Luxembourg, Bahamas, Bermuda, and the BVI. Capital amnesty only worked for about 15% of capital, where owners of assets used the new law to declare their assets to the Russian authority. In 2018, capital flight accelerated, And in 2019, it actually continued to accelerate further. To complicate the answer to your seemingly simple question, the lead jurisdictions of accepting Russian capital still remain the same. It's Cyprus, the BVI, the Bahamas, Ireland, Netherlands, Hong Kong, and Luxembourg. But now there is a very peculiar development stemming partly from a particular political wing of the regime that are using offshore competition in the bigger geopolitical struggle. Again, nothing to do with tax, but there seems to be emerging a program of creating Russia's own offshore financial network, post-Soviet financial network, as a response to geopolitical tensions and competition from the Second British Empire in particular. Jurisdictions that are earmarked as the new offshore zones are Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Moldova, Georgia, and Armenia, as well as some Russian enclaves within the Federation. And I will end this with a very interesting quote from one of the analysts who was asked to provide an estimate of what such a network could do. This is a direct quote: "With a correct oversight and administration, we will be able to create a true black hole into which capital from Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Middle East, and possibly Africa and South America will fly. If we're courageous enough, we can aim to create a crypto offshore. This will make it harder for our opponents to cut off our offshores from the international financial system." This was written at the end of 2018, and as far as I observe the developments, some of these marginal post-Soviet offshore hubs are being created in the former Soviet territory. So to answer your question about states' autonomy, tax autonomy, there are very interesting cases where that is not even a concern for using, enabling, and advancing the use of offshore further. Tax seems to be a marginal concern. It could be a question of path dependency, but it clearly is now an evidence that offshore competition is being used as geopolitical tool. With this, I finish. Thank you very much. I would be happy to answer questions over email if there are any emerging. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Palan and Professor Nesvetailova.